Go ahead.
Okay, so our tonight's speaker for our backyard forest management class, her name's Elizabeth Jamison, or EJ. She's a Northeast District Forester with the Kansas Forest Service. She works with private landowners and forests in 10 counties to improve ecosystem health and functionality, wildlife habitat, and forest resource sustainability. EJ grew up in upstate New York and attended the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry for her undergraduate degree. She went on to receive her MS in forestry from the University of Vermont, where she studied a globally rare pitch pine barrens ecosystem. She moved to Lawrence, Kansas in 2021 and started working for the Kansas Forest Service shortly after. EJ loves spending her free time exploring new and old places. You can find her gravel biking, that's interesting, canoeing, fishing, tossing a frisbee, reading, or relaxing with her cats. You'll have to explain gravel biking to me at some point.
Oh, it's a great time. It's truly just biking, but on gravel roads as opposed to, out on dirt, mountain trails or on roads.
Okay, okay, very interesting. All right, well, EJ, go ahead and take it away. And yeah, we'll have questions at the end.
Sounds good. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you so much to everybody for joining tonight. I am EJ. I am the Northeast District Forester with the Kansas Forest Service, and tonight I'm going to be talking to you about backyard forest management. Um, Get this moving here. Yep. So before we dive into my presentation, I just wanted to give you an overview about myself and what I do as a forester, and then my agency that I work for, which is Kansas Forest Service. We are a state agency. We are actually part of K-State within the research and extension branch, and our mission is sustaining and enhancing natural resources and communities through forestry and wildland fire management. So we have a bunch of different programs so there's a lot of ways to get involved with us. I'm part of the rural forestry program. There are 7 district foresters scattered across the state. I cover the 10 counties in Northeast Kansas, including Johnson County. So day in, day out, I spend most of my time in the woods, working with almost exclusively private landowners to help them manage their forest to achieve a variety of different objectives, oftentimes wildlife habitat, but also overall ecosystem value and health and timber value as well. I also get to do some education and outreach, which is what I'm up to tonight. And I love getting out in the woods. I like PowerPoint presentations too, but if you ever get a chance to join me on a woodland walk, it's a lot of fun. Um, Other programs we have at Kansas Forest Service, we have a fire program, we have a conservation trees and shrubs program, so we sell trees and shrubs for conservation purposes, and we also have a community forestry program. So lots of different ways to get connected. But moving into my talk for this evening, I'm going to kind of move us through this forest management formula. This is essentially what forestry looks like day in, day out, what we do on the ground. And so, first, when it comes to assessing a forest and deciding what management practices we might want to implement, we have to start with an assessment of the forest structure and composition. So, what species are growing there? How dense are those trees growing together? What's going on in the understory? What kind of plants are there? And are there any health concerns that we need to be aware of, something like an invasive species? We also need to pay a lot of attention to land features. So, are there any water sources on the property, like streams or lakes or ponds? What soils are there? Are the soils sufficient to support the current vegetation or any vegetation somebody might want to establish in the future? What is the topography like? Are there any special sites? Those are all things that we're assessing in those early stages of developing a forest management plan. Then the key thing here, forestry is very objective driven, right? We're working with landowners to achieve their goals within the context of forest structure and composition and those land features. We work with a bunch of different goals. The most common goal, at least here in Northeast Kansas, is wildlife habitat, also ecological value, forest health, and forest products. Bunch of different goals that we'll talk more about later. And then lastly, we take all those 3 things together and we develop management prescriptions for a site. And when I use that word prescription, I'm using it just like a doctor would, right? So developing these prescriptions to treat a specific ailment, or in this case, a specific forest to achieve a specific goal. And so we have a bunch of different management prescriptions. Some of the more common ones I work with is thinning. So maybe we want to thin a forest to remove some less desirable species to promote some more desirable species within our goals. Invasive species removal, that's really big. Maybe some tree planting, a bunch of different things that we'll dive into. So I'll walk through all of these, starting with this first one, forest structure and composition. So yes, when it comes to managing forests in your backyard, you'll want to get an assessment of what's going on in your forest in terms of what's growing there and how it's growing. Just to back up a little bit, just some background information about forests in Kansas. Backing up before colonization, forests covered about 4 to 8% of the total land area in Kansas, and they were primarily in riparian bottomlands. Riparian meaning alongside streams. So trees are thirsty, they like to grow where there's good access to water, so that's where most of our forests were. And our forests were actively managed by Native Americans, and they still are today. The photo in the upper right there is of the state champion pecan tree at Fort Leavenworth. State champion basically just means that it's the most magnificent species or tree of that species in Kansas. So there's a bunch of different metrics that go into that. Um, but that tree, it's a pecan tree, and pecans are really common in southeast Kansas, not so much northeast Kansas. So it's kind of this disjunct population, and people have wondered why it's kind of randomly here. And so it's thought that these trees were planted intentionally by Native Americans to have a food source further north, because pecans, if you haven't tried pecans, you definitely have to. They're wonderful food to have around. So that's a really cool legacy of indigenous land management on our landscape still today. So moving on today, about 5% of our land area in Kansas is covered in forests. That equates to about 2.5 million acres. Plus, there's an additional 1.6 million acres in agroforestry and community trees. For agroforestry, think of things like windbreaks. Community trees, think of trees in your cities and urban areas. And we also have a broader geographic distribution of our forests, and those forests have increased in density by 106% since 1965. So lots of change there. There's a Kansas land cover map there in the bottom left, and you can see kind of the brown colors are woodland. So it's mostly concentrated in eastern Kansas, but it is present throughout the state. And so there's a bunch of different reasons for why we've seen kind of these changes to our forest over time. But overall, a lot of those riparian corridors, right, where forests historically have grown, those have been converted to agriculture or developed for urbanization. So we've lost a lot of those forests. At the same time, we've seen a lot of forests develop in areas that weren't previously forested, more upland areas that were probably prairie historically. We'll get into all that in a minute here too. But here's an overview of the different Kansas forest types that we have in the state. Of course, there's a lot of variability within these. They're not strict categories, but it's useful to kind of name our forests based on the primary species in that forest. So starting on the left there, we have oak hickory forests dominated by oak and hickory trees. These forests often develop on drier, more upland sites. Then we have elm, ash, cottonwood forests. Those grow often in riparian corridors along rivers there. So those species like to have a little bit more wet of an environment. And then lastly, we have cedar hedge locust forests. These tend to be younger forests, more early successional forests, and cedar hedge and locust are all very opportunistic. So they kind of like to establish once there's change going on in an environment. So these different forest types will become established on a site because of that site itself. You know, how much moisture is there? What is the topography like? So that will lend itself to different species composition. But there is also another really important factor that we have to talk about when we're talking about any ecosystems in Kansas, and that is fire. You might not know this. People typically think about fire in the context of grasslands in Kansas, but a lot of our woodlands are also fire adapted. In particular, oak trees, every single stage of their life has some sort of adaptation for fire. Those photos on the top there, those are photos from the 2023 prescribed fire in Rice Woodland, which is part of the Baldwin Woods, which is owned by KU Field Station. And so that photo on the right, you see that big oak right in the forefront of the photo. That has really thick insulating bark, and it's really good at protecting itself from fire, much more so than some other species that aren't quite as fire adapted. But fire regimes is the pattern in fire application over time. And they're characterized by the interval. So, how frequent is that fire happening? The intensity, how hot is that fire? The seasonality, what time of year is that fire coming through? The horizontal spread, is it patchy or is it really uniform as it spreads horizontally? And the vertical spread, is it climbing anything like trees? Um, and lastly, of course, the geographic size, the area that it's covering. So different fire regimes will promote different plant communities. This is a really cool figure from a 2014 paper, and it's going to kind of walk you through some of these different communities maintained under different fire regimes. So starting with grasslands, grasslands would be maintained with fire coming every 1 to 3 years or so on average. And so keeping fire at that interval will maintain grassland. If fire stops or becomes less frequent, that same site might transition to a shrubland when more woody plants can get established. And that shrubland will be maintained with fire every 1 to 8 years or so. If we have further fire suppression, less fire occurring in the landscape, we see woodlands start to establish on the far right there. And in that photo, it's showing a 3 to 8 year fire return interval, but that can be very broad if we extend that beyond woodlands and into forests and to denser sites. That photo there, I wouldn't really call that a woodland. It's more of an eastern red cedar thicket, which is one of those species that is really good at taking over prairies once fire is removed. But even think of a mature woodland that you might have walked through. If there was an oak component, that probably burned on average every 8 years or so in this region. So fire is super important to these ecosystems. Before colonization, fire was very intentionally used by Native Americans to control plant communities, but also gain movement across the landscape. And then in the 1900s, a fire suppression policy was kind of adopted by the US Forest Service. So if fire started, it was going to be put out. And so now there are a lot of efforts to kind of relook at how fire is being applied to our landscape, using prescribed fire and recognizing that not all fire is bad fire. Some fire can have some really important ecological benefits, especially when we're keeping it within those fire regimes that are native to that landscape. So just wanted to touch on fire a little bit because it does explain if the forest in your backyard, if you're seeing a lot of cedar or hedge or honey locust, it's probably the result of the removal of a disturbance like fire that might have kept some of those species in check more historically. Okay, now that we've gotten that kind of covered, we'll move into forest structure and composition, on the landscape today. How have all those past processes resulted in what you have on your property today? So I get to look at a bunch of different aspects of the forest, forest density, so a measure of how tightly those trees are growing and how much area of the forest is essentially covered by tree trunk. We can have really open forests. We often call those woodlands, a little bit more open. Or that picture on the bottom left there is a pretty dense system, right? There's a lot of vegetation growing in there, a lot of trees packed in pretty tightly. We also look for signs of pests and pathogens. We'll talk about this later, but that is some emerald ash borer damage. So want to make sure if there are any signs of pests or pathogens going on in the forest that we have that incorporated into our plan. Invasive species is huge. I spend a lot of my time thinking about invasive species. So these are species that are not native to Kansas and are causing harm. So that photo in the top right is of a forest that has a severe bush honeysuckle infestation. You can see where the landowner has been clearing some honeysuckle to make some trails, but otherwise you can't even walk through this forest because it is so dense. And that's, a sign of something that is pretty severe, needs to be addressed. And then the bottom right there, understory vegetation. That's a photo of Dutchman's Britches, which is a spring ephemeral, plants that flower really, really early in the spring. I took that just yesterday. It was the first Dutchman's Britches flower I've seen this year. So that was exciting. And understory vegetation can really clue you in to what's the kind of the history of the stand of the forest and what's going on today. That plant in particular is a really high quality site indicator. You're not going to have that plant just popping up anywhere. it's going to be present mostly in really high quality forests that have been forests for a very long time. So all of these things kind of put together can help you get an idea of that forest, of the species that are growing there, and what are the underlying dynamics that have resulted into that forest being around today. Okay, cool. That moves us on to land features. Um, I won't go into too much depth here, but there's a bunch of different things that we'll assess when it comes to land features. We will look for things like the topography of the site. That kind of middle photo there is taken at the top of a ridge in a forest that had a ton of topography. A lot of people say Kansas is flat, and some parts are, of course, but especially, kind of along the Missouri River, we have some really impressive bluffs. And so that forest had a lot of up and down to it. And that will really impact the site. For instance, like a north slope tends to be a lot cooler and more moist than a southern facing slope. We got to look at the soil types, many different soil types present in the state, and that will give you a good idea of, what that site is essentially able to support. Water bodies, are there streams, rivers, lakes, ponds on the property? We have to make sure we're maintaining those riparian areas and promoting water quality. And then also special sites. That's a photo of a limestone cliff that had some really old etchings into the stone there. So we want to be aware of things like that to make sure they're not going to be negatively impacted by anything we're doing in the woods. So a bunch of things to read the landscape there. Okay, getting into goals is where it gets real exciting here. We have so many different forest management goals here in Northeast Kansas. I've listed a few that I'll walk through here. The most common question I get is how to improve wildlife habitat on a property. Most often, people are interested in deer, turkey, and quail, some of those game species, and managing for those species often has a ton of auxiliary benefits for other species as well. So that photo on the top left there under wildlife habitat is showing a project where we felled some small trees on the edge of the forest at 45-degree angles into an adjacent prairie. And so that took some vertical habitat and turned it horizontal, which wildlife love to have. Having that kind of cover as they're moving around. They don't like those really sharp distinctions between grassland and forest. We kind of get that transition zone going. We call it edge feathering. Also, really important for wildlife habitat is actually dead wood. Trees have a lot to give even after they die. And so many different insects and fungi, and of course, cavity nesters, things like woodpeckers, rely on having that standing dead wood. So that's a photo of a woodpecker hole there. Other things that people manage their forest for, forest health, of course. So addressing any invasive species. Bush honeysuckle, again, you'll hear me talk about it a lot today, is a really bad issue here in Northeast Kansas, and it's one of those ecosystem changers. Once you have that plant on your property, it starts to drastically alter an ecosystem to the point of putting it on a different trajectory. Um, Biodiversity. Oftentimes, managed forests, when we're managing a forest, we're introducing disturbance and we're introducing complexity in a lot of instances in some of these ecological forestry plans. So we're essentially expanding the habitat available for plants, animals, fungi, all of the above. So we're creating more complexity in the landscape, which is going to give more opportunity. There's another photo of some spring ephemerals there, and those are plants that flower really, really early in the season. They're flowering right now. And so their whole goal is to capture sunlight before trees leaf out and shade them. So if you have a really, really dense forest, there's not going to be as much sunlight getting into that understory to help get those spring ephemerals the sunlight they need. Next up, restoring function. That top photo is a photo of a riparian restoration project where we are planting trees and shrubs to help stabilize that bank. Also, there's some structural stability there. So the goal there is to help prevent erosion and then also filter water and promote water quality. So kind of restoring the function of that riparian forest that was lost when that forest was kind of cut there. So the goal there is restoring that function of stream bank protection. The photo on the bottom there is a direct cedar where we've done a lot of nut planting, acorns, hickory nuts, walnuts, to get a lot of dense trees established in those riparian areas. And then lastly, forest products. Um, Forests are growing a renewable resource, right? Trees grow back. And when done considering many objectives, forest products can be one of those objectives. And so, especially in cases where there are valuable trees that need to come out of the forest for a variety of different reasons, we can definitely manage forests to have a ton of other benefits in addition to harvesting forest products. So that top photo under that section, those are black walnut trees and a walnut plantation. And the bottom photo there is of Osage orange trees, which are often used for fence posts. Okay, perfect. That covers kind of the objective section here. And so now we'll move on to management prescriptions. So we're taking forest structure and composition, land features, and goals, combining them together, and we're putting together management prescriptions that work for that forest and that landowner with those goals. So a bunch of different options here. This, as a forester, is where I get to apply silviculture, which is my favorite word. It's defined as the art and science of controlling the establishment, growth, composition, health, and quality of forests. Um, so here are some of these prescriptions that we work with in Northeast Kansas. This isn't all of them, so this is kind of a simplification here, but just to give you an idea of what we're kind of doing day in, day out. Let's start with thinning on the upper right there. Um, Oftentimes, if the goal is promoting oak and hickory, we might thin some other species out of the forest to give those trees more growing space and conditions that favor their growth. So oaks are compared to some of our other native trees are relatively shade intolerant. So if we have a really dense forest, there'll be a lot of shade, and those oak seedlings aren't good at making it in a lot of shade, and then eventually recruiting to be saplings, and then eventually all the way making it to the overstory. So sometimes we'll have to thin a forest to promote the species that we want to see there in the long run. Similarly, prescribed fire, oaks are very fire adapted, so we might include prescribed fire in a plan to give those oaks a competitive advantage, and to potentially reduce wildfire risk in that site over time too. Crop tree release, that's when if you have some really high value trees, you can release them from competition with their neighbors and give them more growing space. Harvest, we talked about. We don't write plans for forest harvests as with the Kansas Forest Service, but we can help kind of advise folks on how to go about that. And then tree planting. I often focus on kind of forest management activities that will sustain the forest naturally regenerating itself. So tree planting can be, not always, but it's sometimes a last resort. So in that photo in the bottom left there, that was at a site that didn't have too many super desirable trees. It was mostly hedge, honey locust, and cedar. It was kind of a younger forest, but the goal was to establish a more mature forest with more desirable species for wildlife over time. So those little tubes there, those are 5-foot tree shelters placed around little oak and hickory seedlings. And so we kind of stabbed those little seedlings in throughout the forest in little gaps. So that's just kind of an overview of some of the management prescriptions we apply in forested settings. The other really key part about forest management activities is monitoring to make sure we're achieving those desired effects. So the photo on the right there is bush honeysuckle. If you went through and spent who knows how many hours clearing honeysuckle out, you want to make sure that you maintain that and keep at it to really get that plant out of there. So you need to be monitoring to make sure you're following up and killing any plants that maybe survived treatment or were missed. The photo in the middle there is of a little oak seedling. So if your goal is oak regeneration, let's go out and look and make sure we're getting little oak seedlings developing, but then that those are also eventually maturing. Sometimes oaks will just kind of hang out as little seedlings for quite a while, and then it will take some sort of release to get them to mature up into saplings. Okay, that brings us to some more kind of specific forest management recommendations for your backyard. Obviously, these things won't always be applicable, but these are the things that I see people encounter in, kind of small forest settings or in urban areas, and they also apply to larger forests as well. But these are some things that you can do with potentially relatively few tools just in your backyard. So I'll go through a few invasive and opportunistic species, some pests and pathogens, and then we'll start talking about more, or I guess less bummer of things, some wildlife habitat, pollinator habitat, and then I'll finish off with some resources and organizations that can help support you. Okay, bush honeysuckle, sorry, I've said it a lot. It is the number one threat to Kansas forests, especially in the eastern half of the state, or probably even more. Um, the nice thing about this plant is it's really easy to identify, especially right now. It is the first thing to green up in the spring. So I'm not really seeing anything start to leaf out right now except for those spring ephemerals. But bush honeysuckle is going for it. It is also the last thing to enter dormancy in the fall, so it'll stay green longer than native vegetation. Um, it has bright red berries, which are produced in the fall. It has opposite leaves that has these curved veins, and they have these pretty woody stems that if you cut into it, you'll see a hollow center. We call that the pith. So this is an invasive species, meaning it's not native to North America. It was native to Asia and was brought over here and intentionally and planted. So this is one that has kind of escaped cultivation to cause some really significant havoc in our forests. There's a lot of good resources on how to control this plant. Mechanical control will stress the plant. It probably won't kill it. So you might want to follow up if you cut it with treating the stump with herbicide or cutting it and then letting it grow back and then spraying that regrowth with herbicide. That's really effective. That cut stump treatment where you're just putting herbicide right on the stump is really awesome because you're just using a tiny little bit of herbicide and it's really effective at killing that plant. Okay, next up, Callery or Bradford pear. This is also the time of year to talk about that because it is flowering right now. You really can't miss it. This is another invasive species that was brought over and planted in ornamental settings. It does have pretty nice looking white flowers, but they smell really bad. Do not recommend sniffing them. And they often have thorns. They're also not super structurally sound. They tend to kind of fall apart in big windstorms. So just, I don't really have anything nice to say about this plant. It is rapidly spreading into our native ecosystems. They cannot, so the issue with this plant is that there was one cultivar that people thought was going to be sterile. It wasn't going to spread, but there was another cultivar introduced, and then those two cultivars could pollinate each other, and now we have them spreading rapidly into our native ecosystems. I don't see it as much of a problem in the forests, although it can kind of creep into the edges. It's mostly a problem for our prairies and our wetlands. If you've ever driven along K10 near Lawrence, it's just absolutely coated with calorie pear. So for this plant, look for those really showy flowers. Look for those kind of round looking leaves. Sometimes it has thorns. And also good news on this plant is Kansas Forest Service. We are partnering on a calorie pair buyback program. So we have 3 dates for the spring, May 12th, May 13th, May 14th in Wichita, Ellsworth, and Manhattan. So if you kill a calorie pair on your property and you take a photo of the stump or the fallen tree, you can register for one of these buyback programs to get a native replacement for your tree. So that's been an exciting progress or project for us to get involved with. Okay, Eastern red cedar. This plant gets a lot of attention in Kansas for very good reason. But this plant is not technically an invasive species. It is native to Kansas. It's our only native conifer, so it is technically not invasive. But I do refer to it as opportunistic, and it has really gotten out of control. There's been an increase in volume in this plant by 23,000% since 1965. So that is a lot of this plant. Um, and the main reason for that, which we talked about earlier, is fire suppression. Without fire coming across this landscape, it gives Eastern Red Cedar the opportunity to get established. And boy, is it good at doing that. A mature tree can produce 1.5 million seeds every year. Oftentimes, those, if they're just fall naturally, they stay pretty close within 200 yards of those trees. But birds can spread them very far distances beyond that one tree individually. The cool thing with this plant is it is dioecious, meaning that there are male trees and female trees. So it's only the female trees that produce those, we call them cedar berries. They look like berries. It's actually a gymnosperm, so it's technically a fleshy cone. But it's only the females that produce that. And you can see that like blue hue to those berries from quite a ways away. The male trees, they do not produce those berries. They produce male cones that are kind of this yellowish color. So, if you've got limited time, limited resources, we all do, if you focus on controlling the female trees, you're going to help prevent the spread of eastern red cedar beyond your property. The big thing here is preventing establishment of this plant. It's pretty easy to kill compared to bush honeysuckle, which is very nice. Um, as long as you cut it below the lowest living green foliage, you're going to kill that tree. It's not going to resprout. And then small trees can be controlled pretty easily with periodic fire. So I guess to summarize this plant, I think of the problem with eastern red cedar taking over our prairies and our grasslands. It's a huge problem. I think of that problem more as a management problem. We need to be addressing and managing our sites to help prevent the species from getting established than a problem with the plant. It is native to Kansas, and if somebody needs a windbreak to help protect homes or agricultural fields or livestock or from soil erosion, if someone needs protection in winter months, we don't really have any other good options for evergreen trees in the state. So definitely a good focus and emphasis here on controlling this plant and preventing its establishment. Okay, so that kind of wraps up our invasive plants and opportunistic plants section that I wanted to talk about. Now I want to touch on some diseases or pests and pathogens that you might be experiencing in your backyard forest. So first off, I wanted to talk about Dutch elm disease. So this Dutch elm disease is a non-native fungus that was brought to the States, and it is spread by a bark beetle, so a little beetle that bores into trees, or it's spread via root grafts. And we had some massive outbreaks in the US in the 1930s and the 1970s. That photo on the right there is showing a street in Detroit. The top photo is from 1971, and the bottom photo is 1984, after Dutch elm disease went through. So you can see it killed all of those mature elms on that street. Um, Only about 1 in 100,000 elm trees are Dutch elm disease tolerant, but there are quite a lot of survivors, most likely because they just escaped exposure. So elm trees have wind dispersed seeds that can fly quite a ways away. So they're pretty good at dispersing, and that might kind of help to insulate some. And there are also some trees that are just outside the range of Dutch elm disease. So in Florida, Alberta, and the British Columbia, there are elm trees there that have not been impacted by Dutch elm disease. And elms in the forest are doing much better. It's much less stressful to be a tree in the forest. There's a lot less stressors from pollution and salt and paving. And then also our forests are often more isolated, so you might not have as much exposure to Dutch elm disease. Compare that to a city where, especially back in the 1930s, there were a ton of monocultures of elm trees planted really close together. And so if you had Dutch elm disease get introduced to a spot like that, it was easily going to wipe through that whole area. That bottom left photo there is of some fruiting bodies of Dutch elm disease, the fungus. We often refer to these fungi as pathogens when it comes to a forestry setting, but I mean, like, fungi are super cool. I really admire them. They've got a lot going on, really interesting stuff. It's when we get some of these non-native fungi that are introduced to an area that has no natural resistance, that's when we start to see some issues. So I don't want it to seem like I'm just hating on fungi. I love fungi. And then similar with beetles too, that photo in the middle is of the galleries from the smaller European bark beetle that vectors the Dutch elm disease. And those galleries are essentially just little tunnels under the bark where those larvae are developing. So there are things you can do to manage Dutch elm disease. First, if you have an elm tree, Be on the lookout for symptoms. The first symptoms you'll see in the upper left there is what we call flagging. It's when leaves turn yellow and start to wilt. That'll be kind of the first sign. After that, the fungus will move down the twigs into the branches and eventually down into the tree. And you'll start to see brown streaks develop in the sapwood, so in that middle photo there. So to test for this, you'll want to collect some twigs. You can scrape off the bark, look for those brown streaks, but you also will want to get the presence of Dutch elm disease confirmed. And you can actually do that through the K-State Diagnostic Lab. So if you just Google that, you'll find a way to do that. So treating this, if you are confirmed to have Dutch elm disease, you'll want to remove branches that have been infected before Dutch elm disease reaches the trunk. That's when you're in big trouble. So you'll want to remove those branches 5 to 10 feet below that last sign of that brown streaking. If you have a dead or dying elm tree, that wood should be removed, and the wood should be buried, debarked, burned, or chipped. If you have other elm trees in the area, you're going to want to sever the root grafts with a vibratory plow before you remove those infected trees. Remember, the disease can also spread via root grafts, how those trees are connected underground. If you want to plant an elm tree, there are Dutch elm disease resistant cultivars that were developed from breeding more resistant trees. And there are also preventative fungicide injections, and that helps prevent infection from beetles, but it's not going to be nearly as effective for preventing infection from root grafts. So not all hope is lost for this species. I see plenty of healthy elm trees out in the woods, but if you have an elm tree, especially in an urban setting, it's something you're going to want to keep an eye out for. Okay, someone else to keep an eye out for, emerald ash borer. So this is another invasive species. It is a bark beetle native to Asia, brought over here to the US. It's really deadly for three main reasons. First, because it is novel, it is invasive. It came to the US in Michigan in 2002. That's when it was first detected, but it probably got here in the early 1900s, or sorry, 1990s. It's also really deadly. Less than 1 in 1,000 ash trees survive. Some researchers saying that there might be some more resistance out there, but everybody likes to think that the one tree in their yard is going to be the one that's spared, and I'm so sorry, but the odds are not in your favor there. It's also widespread. It's found in 37 states. So that map on the right is kind of showing the distribution of ash in the green, and then county level EAB emerald ash borer detections in those red dots. So you can see here in Kansas, we're really on like the western extent of this infestation as it moves across the country. There are some kind of regional detections further west of us, but we're really kind of on this gradient here. That's probably because that's the speed at which the insect has been moving across the landscape, but also we're on a pretty significant climate gradient here, right in the middle of the country, and a moisture gradient. That probably also has something to do with it, also with the distribution of ash trees. But it's a beautiful insect. Again, I love insects. This is the emerald ash borer is pictured there on the bottom left. It has that bright iridescent green color, and it's a tiny little guy. What it actually does is the adults burrow into an ash tree and lay their eggs right under the bark. Those eggs hatch into larvae and tunnel around and feed on that conductive tissue right under the bark. What that eventually does, it eventually girdles the tree. So it stops the ability for the tree to move water and nutrients up and down the tree. So there's a photo of those little galleries there on the left side of that picture on the right. Once those larvae mature, they exit the tree as adult beetles, and they leave these pretty distinct D-shaped exit holes, which you also can kind of see in the picture on the bark side. Managing emerald ash borer, again, prevention is huge. It's very deadly, so at all costs, you want to prevent a tree from being infested. So don't move firewood. These insects can hang out on firewood and be moved great distances just from being, carried around in the back of someone's pickup truck. So buy firewood where you're going to burn it. There was a quarantine on ashwood in Kansas, but the Kansas Department of Agriculture lifted that quarantine in 2021 because the insect is so widespread in Northeast Kansas. On the bottom left there, you can see a map of detections at the county level. And so it's pretty well established throughout Northeast Kansas. It's probably beyond those areas shown there too, but we can only have a 100% confirmed county if we have an actual insect. So not just the signs of those galleries, we want to have an actual insect in hand. As far as managing trees once they are infected, well, there are some insecticide injections that can be used for individual trees. It's most effective if you apply it before your tree has been infested. It can help afterwards too, but ideally you want to start before you see any signs of infestation. If you're interested in having your tree assessed or getting those insecticide injections, you should reach out to a certified arborist. So if you go to the Kansas Arborist Association website, you can find a whole list of certified arborists that can help out with that. Same with the Dutch elm disease injections as well. Okay, the last kind of tree pest or pathogen that I'm going to talk about today is oak wilt. So this impacts primarily oaks in the red oak group. So that would include red oak, the species, and pin oak. The white oak group is not as susceptible. The white oak species is actually pretty good at withstanding, at least being killed from this fungus. And bur oak can also survive for quite a few years after being infected. But oak wilt is actually a native fungus, so it's native to North America. And like Dutch elm disease, it is spread via a beetle, catching a ride in a beetle, as well as root grafts between trees. So again, here prevention is key. One really important thing, do not prune your oaks in the spring. You'll want to prune in the fall around November. That's because the beetles are most abundant and active in the spring, and that's also when most of the spores are being produced. So we don't want to create any wounds in the tree that would facilitate infestation there. So prune in the fall after November. If you do have oak wilt confirmed on your property, so there's some photos of some trees showing signs of oak wilt. Again, you can have twigs tested via the K-State Diagnostic Lab. If you do have confirmed oak wilt on your site, you're first going to want to sever root grafts between any oak trees on your property. You'll want to remove dead and dying trees within that area, and you're also going to want to remove living trees within a buffer of those dying trees. Because this fungus is so good at spreading via roots, we don't want to run the risk of leaving the fungus on site in the roots of a tree that currently looks healthy but might still have that fungus in it. And the spores persist for a year. So you'll want to either destroy the wood that you cut, or you could also tarp it and leave it for a year for those spores to die out. Okay, so now we're moving away from kind of the bummer topics and we'll talk a little bit about wildlife habitat here. There's a bunch of different things you can do to improve wildlife habitat in your backyard. First off, you can promote oak and other mass-producing trees, so trees that produce a big seed, like oaks and hickories and walnuts. Oaks in particular, those acorns are just superfood for wildlife. They are super nutrient dense and protein packed. You can diversify and increase understory vegetation and feather your forest edges. So there's a photo of that edge feathering there where we're creating some horizontal habitat. Wildlife love that. Songbirds will hang out in there. Quail really need a shrub component if you're in a more rural setting where there might be quail. Also creating standing dead wood. I'll show some photos of that, but you can actually, if you have some declining trees or maybe less desirable species, you could consider killing some of those and leaving them standing so that they can be used for fungi, insects, and then, of course, so many different birds as well. Woodpeckers love them. And then also maintaining any big trees you have or any sort of diverse structure in your forest. That photo on the far right is a photo I took, I think that was also yesterday out in the woods. That was a big red-tailed hawk nest and a pretty tall, that was a red oak tree. Okay, so we have an awesome publication called Forest Management for Wildlife. You can find it on our website. And in that publication, we've listed a bunch of different trees, vines, and shrubs, and kind of laid out the value, the food value of those species for wildlife. So just scanning that real quick, you can see that oaks are excellent in every single category. So oaks are just so, so, so important for wildlife. Persimmon, also great. Mulberry, also great. Um, Vines, I know people oftentimes don't like to see vines aesthetically, but they offer some really good wildlife habitat. And Virginia creeper, it turns a gorgeous red color in the fall. So I'm a big fan. Shrubs are awesome. They also provide some structural diversity. The photo on the upper right there is of a fragrant sumac bush in Riley County. And so again, that is a really important shrubby habitat for so many different things. Songbirds will love them. The photo on kind of in the center there, those are some trees that have been girdled. And so this is essentially doing what those insects do, right, that we're talking about with EAB. Girdling, if you take a chainsaw, just cut an inch to inches thick into that tree and ring it all the way around. That will kill the tree while it's standing. You can just do one ring, and then if you wanted to apply herbicide to that cut, that will kill the tree. If you're not going to apply herbicide, then probably do two rings. You don't have to do it this low to the ground, just do it at whatever height is comfortable for you. So then that will create a standing dead tree, great for wildlife. But just make sure you're doing that in an area that's safe to do so. The tree will first drop its kind of small twigs, then bigger branches, and eventually you'll be left with just kind of a standing trunk. But things will be dropping, the tree will eventually fall over. So just be aware where you're doing that. Make sure you're not doing that where it could, in a highly trafficked area or where it could fall on something of value. Okay, pollinator habitat. There's a lot of things you can do for pollinators as well. I've been talking about forestry tonight, but also there's a lot of native plants, a lot of prairie plants that you can help get established on your property that's going to be great for pollinators. And forests and prairies play really nice together. So yes, plant some native grasses and forbs. Maybe convert your lawn to a native garden. And I mentioned oaks earlier. They are just so, so, so important for pollinators. So many different native pollinator species rely on oaks. A bunch of fun photos here. In the upper right is American plum. That's a shrub you could consider planting maybe if you have a forested area and maybe a more open area. Maybe it's a lawn or maybe you have a native wildflower garden. Maybe you could plant some shrubs between those two areas. And so now you can have a transition zone between forest to the more open area. Plus, American plum puts out a fruit that you'll enjoy too. The photo on the top center is of Ohio buckeye. That's a really cool tree. No edible fruit, at least for people, but those flowers are incredible and pollinators love them. Bottom left, this photo was taken by my friend Wendy Holman at the KU field station, and that is a zebra swallowtail ovipositing, laying her eggs on pawpaw. And pawpaw is a super, super cool tree. I naturally see it growing in pretty moist areas alongside streams, but that is another really cool tree that you could consider planting on your property. That middle photo on the bottom is just showing, a pretty diverse meadow there. There's some bee balm close to the camera. So anytime you are introducing biodiversity, a lot of plants, you're going to have a lot of opportunities for a variety of different wildlife species. And then on the photo at the bottom right is just a gorgeous oak tree. Just look at that. So if you do need a tree to plant in your yard, maybe consider planting oak. I highly recommend at least planting a native tree. Okay, we're coming up on the end here and we'll have some time for some questions, but I first wanted to shout out some resources that you might find helpful. At Kansas Forest Service, we have our Conservation Trees and Shrubs program where we sell native trees and shrubs for conservation purposes. And we have a whole seedling selection guide that outlines the native species we sell, its traits, as well as its functions, what it's kind of good for there. iNaturalist is awesome. iNaturalist is essentially social media for plants. It has an algorithm that can help you identify things, but what I really like about it is that you can post the things to your account, and then people who use the app can say, yeah, I think your idea is right, or they can suggest something else. So it's a really good learning tool and just kind of for like essentially keeping a scrapbook of plants that you see. And not just plants, animals too, fungus, really whatever. Um, the Kansas Wildflowers and Grasses website. Oh, gotta check this out. This was just updated. It's run by Mike Haddock, who also helped write the book to the right, which I'll talk about in a second. But this is a really great online database of native plants in Kansas. You can browse by plant type, or if you think you're looking at an oak, but you don't know what kind, you can search oak and then see all of the oaks native to Kansas. It has data from the KU herbarium and some really good range maps, so definitely check that out. And then lastly, Trees, Shrubs, and Woody Vines in Kansas. Awesome book written by Mike Haddock and Craig Freeman. If you're looking for, a paper copy of something to hold in your hand and help you identify things, highly recommend that. Lastly, organizations, a lot of ways to get involved to help kind of grow your understanding of native plants and forestry and all this good conservation work that's going on in the state. Native Lands Restoration Collaborative, Kansas Native Plant Society, Botanical Belonging. Those are all really good nonprofits focused on native plants. Then there's also Friends of the Caw. Their mission is kind of protecting the Kansas River. They have a bunch of really fun field trips, so check them out. The Kansas Forestry Association is essentially a network of folks who are managing forests in the state. So I'm involved with them. So they could be a good community to get involved with. Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks produces a ton of great content and has some really wonderful professionals that are available to help folks with wildlife related questions. Of course, you're familiar with K-State Research and Extension, and then the Nature Conservancy, which does a lot of conservation work in the state. So that's what I've got for you. I'll open up for questions in a second, but first, definitely connect with the Kansas Forest Service. We have our website, kansasforests.org. We have an events calendar there, so definitely stay tuned on that. We have a Facebook, Instagram, X. We have a newsletter that's really great. We have a Kansas Canopy podcast. You can find that anywhere you get your podcasts. Really good information there. And we also have a book club. So really, however you want to stay connected, we'll have an option for you. And then my contact information is in the bottom left there. If you have any kind of specific questions for your property or something you want to chat with me about, feel free to shoot me an email or give me a phone call. But with that, I will stop sharing my screen so I can see the rest of you and answer any questions you got.
Okay, great, EJ. I'm actually going to, I have a little survey that if people would like to fill out, they can access this survey. Just give us some feedback on the presentation and what other topics you guys would like to see. So I'm going to share that really quick, and then we can absolutely get to the questions here. Oop, come on. If my thing is going to work there. Let's see. Let me get to. So one of the first questions that I saw was, what should I plant when I remove honeysuckle? What should I plant in its place?
That is a great question. So yeah, when you're removing honeysuckle, you'll often see under honeysuckle, there's like nothing growing. It really outcompetes plants for by shading plants, and then also it's allelopathic, so it produces a chemical that inhibits other plant growth. So there's often not much there to kind of prevent honeysuckle from coming back. Actually, at Johnson County Parks and Rec, they've seen a lot of success with a seed mix that goes heavily with river oats and wild rye. So those are two woodland grasses that can kind of tolerate the shade of a forest, but they're native, but they're pretty aggressive. So they're pretty good at getting in there and getting established. So I'd highly recommend those two. And then they also kind of added a few woodland forbs, some flowers in there as well to kind of promote some more diversity in the mix. But those are two really good go-to grasses after bush honeysuckle.
Okay, so the next question that we have, what herbicide would you recommend for honeysuckle?
Yes. So it kind of depends on the method that you're going with, but glyphosate does work really well for that cut stump treatment. So you can just cut the stump and then apply the glyphosate directly to the stump. If you're cutting, I mean, sometimes these plants get like big. Like if it's starting to look like a tree, for those larger plants, triclopyr works really well too. So there's some good publications online that kind of outline, exactly what rates to spray under or to use under these different circumstances, but those are kind of the go-to ones. Because there's also basil bark sprays, which will be a little bit different. So it really kind of depends on the methodology you want to use.
Yeah, so I think some of our volunteers use a dilution of glyphosate of
Mhm.
around, I mean, I think they're using 20 to 30%. What dilution would you recommend?
Yeah, so that can work pretty well for that cut stump method.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, I've seen some plants survive that for the cut stumps, so you might want to bump it up to around 50%, but see
Okay.
what's working for your site. I think we've seen effectiveness with down to 20% for that. If you're spraying foliage, 1 to 2% solution of glyphosate will work for that.
Mm, okay.
Good.
Um, the next question, are honey locusts good or bad?
Yes. Uh, anytime we're kind of making these forest management decisions, good or bad really depends on your goals. Unless we're talking about invasive species that are causing like really significant damage at an ecosystem level, it really depends on your site and your goals for whether something is good or bad. When it comes to honey locust, oftentimes people aren't a huge fan of them because they do produce those massive thorns and they are kind of opportunistic. So they do kind of like to take over prairies. If you've ever been in a prairie where there's a ton of like small diameter trees that are just getting going, probably a lot of those are honey locust. So oftentimes people are looking to remove them. That being said, they do produce those seed pods that wildlife like. They get their name honey locust because there is a sweet substance in there. So I've met people who were intentionally planting honey locusts for their cattle to eventually graze on. So kind of depends there, but oftentimes they're one of the species that if the goal is, kind of restoring a more mature forest or promoting oak and hickory, we'll kind of get that species out of there.
Okay. Um, so then the next one, there is, do you have any recommendations for small bushes and evergreens in urban flower beds?
Ooh, I love that question. Um, Small bushes, a lot of our native shrubs don't stay very small for very long. They tend to get pretty big. That being said, I planted a low grow cultivar of fragrant sumac in my front yard, and it is gorgeous. It has stayed really small, and those leaves are beautiful, and they turn a really nice fall color, nice red color in the fall. So I've been really happy with that. There's also fragrant sumac. You also don't have to use the low grow variety. You could plant the native one as well. And then buffalo currant is really good. American plum is really good, but again, those are all going to get pretty big. For evergreens, unfortunately, I don't have too many good recommendations because again, Asian red cedars are only native conifer. So you can find a bunch of different evergreens at nurseries here, but it's hard to be an evergreen in Kansas with our climate, and so they're a little bit riskier in terms of their survival and persistence.
Okay. Now that I did that, I can't see the comments. Hold on. Oh, here we go. Okay. All right. As we eradicate invasive honeysuckle on our property, would a mulch border keep it from encroaching from our neighbor, Shawnee Mission Park? Oh, interesting.
Yeah, good question. I believe they're working on getting rid of honeysuckle there. And it's a big park, so it's not going to be a tomorrow done thing, but hopefully that'll become less of an issue in the future. Um, a mulch border probably won't, unfortunately, because those berries are also spread from birds, so birds can fly kind of anywhere. But if you were to if you were to apply even like a larger mulched area, that will help with weed suppression in general. But it probably wouldn't be super good at that eliminating that species or super efficient for that. But that's a good thought.
Okay. This one's, how would you recommend getting rid of poison ivy in a small clearing that is surrounded by trees and backs up to a stream?
Yeah. So yeah, poison ivy. Obviously, when you're working with poison ivy, make sure you're wearing protective gear. I don't actually react to poison ivy, which is super handy for my profession, but I heard that can change at any time, so I'm still careful around it. Um, So yes, it's interesting you say that it backs up to a stream. I often see vines the most dense in riparian areas alongside streams, and I think that's because water brings these seeds really easily. And then if an area does flood, it spreads those seeds and creates a disturbance that allows those species to get established. Um, I would say your best bet is just going up to the trees and cutting them at like 3 feet above the ground. You just want to make sure that that root that's hanging isn't going to be touching the soil because you don't want it to reroot. Or that vine that's hanging, excuse me. You don't want it to touch the ground because you don't want it to reroot. That is really effective. If it's a really bad infestation and you're worried about it, you might want to apply a little bit of herbicide in the cut end. You could probably get away with just cutting it.
Okay. And how do you attract swallowtail butterflies to pawpaw trees?
Such a fun question. Um, I don't know if there's anything you can really do aside from planting the pawpaw trees. If you already have pawpaw trees, then I think you're kind of good to go. Yeah, when pawpaws get going, they can really get going. I've seen some really intense pawpaw groves, but they're also often a little bit, I don't really see them growing in too many places. Once you find the right place, you see a lot of them. So I'd say the most important thing is maintaining your pawpaws. And then if you're in an area that has more connectivity to other pawpaws, that's where you're probably going to get the most swallowtail butterflies to come through to them. But yeah, I don't know if there's anything you can do in particular. I guess something to note there too. So the zebra swallowtails lay their eggs on the pawpaw trees, but they're not actually the pollinator. Pawpaw produces these really cool, like dark maroon colored flowers that actually I haven't really noticed this, but apparently if you're a fly or a beetle, it smells like rotting flesh. So it attracts flies and beetles to pollinate it which is interesting there. So we often think about the zebra swallowtails associated with that species, but they're not actually the pollinator. Those swallowtails just need those plants to reproduce.
Okay, okay, very interesting. So, Renee asks, is Tordon too potent on honeysuckle?
Um, so for these herbicide recommendations, um, the answer is probably not, but you definitely want to be applying herbicide according to the label. So just definitely check out the label, make sure you're mixing it correctly. There is a really good guide that K-State puts out every year. It's the weed control guide, and that will kind of list what herbicides and specifically what, brand names are effective on what plants and how to mix them. So I definitely check that out. Um, one applied correctly, probably not, but it is one that can be a little bit hotter than others. But just make sure you're, yeah, applying, following the label, and wearing all personal protective equipment.
Okay. Yes, I'd say from our experience, if you are not careful with Tordon, you can do a lot of damage to things you don't want to kill. So it's one of those you
Mhm.
just have to really be careful. But I mean, you have to be careful with all of them, but Tordon especially, it seems to be very potent. Uh,
Mhm.
so, oh, this is a good one for Johnson County. How to keep Johnson grass in city green space from taking over my adjacent backyard.
Yeah, that is a good question. I don't deal with too much Johnson grass because it doesn't get in the forest too much. So whew, that's someone else's problem. But no, I would say, Amy, maybe you have something to say to this too, but I would say again, refer to that. So Johnson County is qualified as a noxious weed in Kansas. So you can get herbicide at a discounted rate from your county noxious weed department. So I definitely chat with them for herbicide there. And then again, that weed control manual has good recommendations for herbicide. Unfortunately for Johnson grass, I think that herbicide is kind of the best bet for that one.
Yeah, that's definitely the problem with Johnson grass is that it spreads by seeds and rhizomes. So you can't just make sure that you're um, mowing it and stuff before it goes to a seed because it's still going to spread by rhizome. So it's going to take a whole management plan to actually eradicate it, and that's exactly why it's spreading like it is.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah.
so Can you tell us more about the range of on-site support you provide?
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of on-site support, I do site visits to properties in the 10 counties in Northeast Kansas. If you're outside that range, if you're not in Johnson County, there's a different forester that would cover your area. And so if somebody has 10 acres of forest, then we can schedule a site visit. And we can walk the forest, talk about the plants that are growing there, and of course, spend a lot of time talking about the landowner's goals, and what they're hoping to achieve. And then based on the forest data I gather and their goals, I'll often put together a forest management plan. And what the plan is essentially just a step-by-step treatment schedule for the forest. So we've been talking about bush honeysuckle. If there's bush honeysuckle present, that'll probably be the first step. So it'll have specific guidance for how to get rid of that honeysuckle. And then, any follow-up treatments you want to do, whether that be forest thinning, planting some trees, establishing some grasses and forbs, all that. So I do the in-person site visit, talk about the property and the goals, and then provide that plan if it seems like that would be a benefit to the landowner.
Nice. Okay, awesome. So we've got a couple more questions and then I think we will wrap it up. But do you have suggestions for improving a large area where Vinca minor was planted and mixed with Virginia creeper, poison ivy, and winter creeper?
Yeah, yeah, I think it's hard to say without seeing the site. Sometimes, when we're talking about some of these really aggressive, any like really aggressive invasives, I know winter creeper can be a big problem. Sometimes you just kind of have to look at a foliar herbicide spray. Fire applied over the years will help keep those invasive species out, but sometimes you do need to look at a more wide scale foliar application for some of those plants.
Okay. Um, this one's
But
also
again,
about,
oh, sorry, I
oh,
guess I'll
go.
also say there too. Yeah, Virginia creeper and poison ivy can get out of control, but they are native, so not always necessarily a problem. So you just kind of got to, weigh the benefits of where it's growing, maybe where it's getting too aggressive and other areas that it might not be a problem just to leave it.
Okay. The next one's about winter creeper as well. Winter creeper is
Mhm.
climbing so many of my trees. Should I clip and dab the cut ends?
Yep, that's probably your best bet. It's also it depends how extensive that infestation is. If it's really bad, then yeah, you'll want to use some herbicide, but it's also not that hard to pull if it's just a few vines going up, and it might not be feasible, but if you can just pull them by the roots, that works really well. And I should say that can work for other invasives, bush honeysuckle too, if you get that root collar. It doesn't sprout back super vigorously as long as you had that whole root collar. So in those kind of smaller infestations, if you just have a few plants, I'd say definitely first just go for the mechanical control, rip it up, and hopefully that does it. And winter creeper is really important to get at, like you mentioned, as it starts to climb those trees, that's where you want to focus your effort because that's how it reproduces. It produces its fruit once it starts climbing. So those are the good ones to see and target and get out there.
Okay. Um, Mary asks, what time of year should I plant grasses like river oats, wild rye,
Mhm.
in cleared forests adjacent areas?
Yeah. So usually, honestly, like the end of December or so, you can get out there if you're scattering seed. That's a really good time, because those seeds will sit out there through the winter. We'll have freeze thaw cycles that'll pull those seeds into the soil. So if you're scattering seeds, that's a really good time to do it.
Yes, and I will say also that depending on the species, um, some native grasses don't need as much uh, like weathering and stuff to increase their germination. So you can get away with planting them, here in late winter, early spring. But you really want some good soil contact, and that can be a little bit difficult to get. You also don't want necessarily to go and till up the ground. That is just going to cause lots of weed growth. So um, okay. I think this last one, I think Joe is referring to your services.
Mhm.
Is the 10 acres a minimum or is it 5 acres?
Yeah, 10 acres is the minimum for those site visits. Definitely give me a call. We can chat over the phone if you and your neighbors want to kind of do a co-visit. We could coordinate something like that. But yeah, just based on our structure and our funding, we need that 10-acre minimum for a site visit.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Um,
see 20 acres, but five
yeah.
timbered. Yeah, it kind of depends on your goals for that land. So yeah, feel free to reach out and we can chat.
So really quick, this I have one last question that I get quite a bit. So two complaints that homeowners will ask me about is, okay, I want to remove the honeysuckle, but I also don't want my neighbors to be able to see into my yard. And
Mm-hmm.
then I want to remove the honeysuckle. And this is actually something that's been happening at Ernie Miller. The honeysuckle is
Hmm.
removed, and then all of a sudden the noise from the highway and all it just it's so much louder. So
Yeah.
what do you tell people that are trying to do the right thing by removing the honeysuckle? Like, what do they put another type of bush in there or something to block out the view and the sound? What would you say?
Yeah, great question. And it can a lot, removing bush honeysuckle and some of these practices, for removing those invasive species, you are really changing things, right? It's going to look really different afterwards. I typically recommend some native shrubs. They grow really fast. They require very little care. So if you're looking for fast growing, dense, big shrubs, American plum or sandhill plum, those are really, really good options. You could also mix a few other species in there too. Kansas Forest Service, we have our conservation trees and shrubs program. And we sell wildlife and pollinator bundles of shrubs. So you'll have like, I think, five or so different species in there. And so those are really effective at growing quickly, getting kind of in the way to obscure visuals and sound as well. So that's usually what I go for.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I think that that is pretty much it. Thank you, everyone that's still on for attending, and thank you so much, EJ, for all the great information. And hopefully, we'll have you back sometime, maybe in the fall, and we can talk about some more forest stuff. But other than that, everyone be on the lookout for the recording of this talk, and everyone have a great evening.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.